You're listening to Airey Bros Radio. Be there or be square, because it's all killer, no filler.
What is the point of faith if it's not activated to do good in the world? If you call yourself a person of faith and you turned a blind eye to injustice and oppression, not just in your world, but everywhere in the world, then your faith is useless. Your faith is garbage. In the run-up to 79, there was this clamoring, and you would hear it all the time. Where are the Baskervilles of today? Where is the Baskerville to come to us in our time of need? When I was growing up in Iran, there were schools named Howard Baskerville. There were streets named Howard Baskerville. Originally, I was like, hey, here's this, this American who's a hero in Iran, and I'm gonna write about him for Americans who don't know anything about him. Nobody in Iran knows who this kid is anymore. I think that in a way he can be a symbol for a new way of thinking. This is Reza Aslan, and you're listening to Airey Bros Radio.
We have a good friend who is Iranian, and he probably left similar time frame around when you and your family left. He went to Germany as well before he came to the United States to go to school and everything. And he was kind of giving me his story, and I guess it's very different as an American and how the cookie cutter version, I guess, of what we get in terms of our history and the history of Iran. And I was wondering, maybe for our guest, if you could kind of maybe, you've probably done this quite a few times, but kind of share, your version and how things were and what things were like versus kind of what we hear or what most Americans know or think of Iran.
Sure. You mean before the revolution?
Yes, sir.
Well, look, it depends on who you were.
Yeah.
If you were wealthy and secular and connected to the government, life was fantastic before the revolution. I think that sometimes right now, 40-something years into an oppressive, murderous theocracy, makes us have a false impression of what came before. Make no mistake, what came before was a murderous, oppressive dictatorship that was just replaced with a different kind of murderous dictatorship. But the Shah was a bloodthirsty criminal. And I know that, you say that, and a lot of Iranians get very, very angry with you. And they're like, oh, you're just an apologist for the mullahs, etc. But it's just a fact. You're talking about a tyrant who was removed from power once in 1953 and then forcefully placed back on the throne by the CIA, and then who used that experience to create one of the most frightening police states the world had ever seen, including a secret police force, the Savak, that became sort of infamous around the world for the disappearances of people, the re-education of people, etc., etc. I think people have to understand that there was a reason why there was a massive revolution in 79 to overthrow this man. And by the way, that revolution was not an Islamic revolution. That's post-propaganda, post-revolutionary propaganda. That revolution was, and this is actually a sociological fact, the largest revolution of the 20th century, insofar as the percentage of the population that took part in it. But we're talking about communists and Marxists and leftists, and yes, religious groups as well. The pious poor, those were the masses that were on the street, but there were men and women and Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians. This was a massive anti-imperialist revolution against a dictator who had long ago lost the support of the people that he was ruling against. And for a very brief time after that, in late 79, very early 1980s, there was some hope in Iran. People forget that after the Shah was kicked out of Iran, what replaced him was a technocratic government that was going through the hard slog of trying to rewrite a constitution, recreate a truly democratic, modern constitutional state, rebuild its relationship with the world, try to mend its relationship as much as possible with the United States. But that government was derailed by two major events. The first was the hostage crisis. In November, there was a group of students loyal to Khomeini who took over the US embassy and held 52 Americans, ultimately for 444 days. The transitional government tried desperately to free those Americans, but the Khomeinyists, those in line with Khomeini, literally termed the hostage crisis the real revolution, right? This was the moment in which they were able to use the post-revolutionary chaos to take advantage of, the political situation and take control. And ultimately, I think some 50 days or something into the hostage crisis, the transitional government collapsed and Khomeini was able to take control. But that still wasn't the biggest thing that turned post-revolutionary Iran into the oppressive theocratic government it is today. That thing is the thing that for some reason Americans tend to forget. We remember the hostage crisis, but we forget what happened almost immediately afterwards, which is an 8-year-long devastating war that began when Iraq, with American military and intelligence support, attacked Iran, leading to what I said is it was an 8-year war with 1 million deaths total. You're trying to rebuild an entire country from scratch in the middle of what I think many Iranians viewed as an existential war, a war that was really a proxy war, by the United States, which we now know was, supplying Saddam Hussein with not just military know-how, but with satellite images of Iran, like really supporting the Iraqi side in this war. And, even in our recent history here in the United States, we know that in times of war, it's often the strong man that becomes the sort of unquestioned authority, and that's what happened. It's a shame. I mean, I think that for a while Iran had the opportunity to become something different, but internal politics, external forces, and a just absolutely just awful hostage situation, which by the way wasn't ever meant to be a hostage situation. I mean, this is a whole other story, but I mean, anyone who has studied the hostage crisis knows that it was meant to be a 2-day sit-in. That was the plan. We're just going to take over the embassy for 2 days to make sure that that the CIA doesn't again replace the Shah on the throne like they did in 1953. Recall that the hostages, the U.S. embassy was seized the day after President Carter allowed the Shah into the United States, ostensibly for cancer treatment. But this is the way with history, right? And so these little tiny things that happen that sort of derail the hopes and dreams of people. And here we are 40 something years later, and Iranians are still clamoring for the most basic rights, right? I mean, we're not talking about anything other than the ability to have a say in the decisions that rule your life. That's not asking a lot. That's literally the most basic of human rights. And just kind of one of those historical tragedies that, uh, and by the way, not just 40 years, but more than 100 years of clamoring for these rights, and the Iranians are still living under an oppressive system.
Is there any hope?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's always hope.
Yeah.
But I think that in this case, there's concrete hope. And that hope rests not just in this generation that we have seen, certainly not just last year with the death of Masa Jinnah Amini, but that we have seen for 2 decades now, constantly rising up, pushing back against this regime, clamoring for human rights and refusing to give up in the face of the most barbaric acts of violence from this government. But I will say that there's the hope also rests in the fact that over those last 2 decades, this regime has lost any sense of legitimacy, right? That a regime that is founded upon the notion that they are the moral framework of society, right? That is the foundation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their whole raison d'etre, the reason that they exist, right? The argument that they make for themselves is that we're the moral foundation of society. Nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believes that. The religious right in Iran doesn't believe that anymore. The pious masses, they don't believe that anymore. They have no constituency left. What they have created is the equivalent of a mafia state, essentially. They cannot, this is a regime that cannot survive except for the expression of force and violence, right? That's their only means of survival at this point. In the 80s and the 90s, look, they weren't all that popular in the 80s and 90s either, but at the very least, they had a constituency, right? They had millions of what we call the pious masses who truly did see the state as the sort of the moral foundation of the society. that's impossible. It's almost impossible to find anyone who would make that argument any longer. The regime still has supporters, but those supporters are primarily people who are invested in the survival of this regime, invested either politically or economically, whose entire kind of survival depends on this regime not collapsing. And there are so many of them. I mean, make no mistake about it. But insofar as ideological supporters of what this regime pretends to be, it's very difficult to find people like that in Iran any longer.
Reza, your latest book is An American Martyr in Persia, the epic life and tragic death of Howard Baskerville. I couldn't help when I started reading the book and searching Howard Baskerville that he was the original Searching for Sugar Man. Everyone in Iran, when you were growing up, knew who he was. You come to the United States, no one knows who he was. Was that shocking to you?
It was. I mean, I honestly, for me, like Howard Baskerville was America, like it's just kind of, he was so symbolic of the country. And, even as a kid, I was sophisticated enough to know that, okay, this was 100 years ago. I get it. And things are different now, et cetera, et cetera. But, we were talking about 79. In the run up to 79, there was this clamoring, and you would hear it all the time, not just in the Persian press, but even in the English language press, of where are the Baskervilles of today? Like, where is the Baskerville to come to us in our time of need today? And then so when I came to the United States and discovered nobody has heard of this kid who is, at least back then, certainly not the case, 40 something years after the revolution, but back then, this was a kid who was lionized, in Iran. He was considered a martyr. And if you know anything about Iranian society, the term martyr carries an enormous amount of weight, right? And to give that designation to a 22-year-old Christian missionary from Nebraska tells you, the way in which generations of Iranians used to think about this kid.
Who did you write this book for? Did you write it for people in the United States or people in Iran?
It's funny, both, because as I started to write this book, originally I was like, hey, here's this, this American who's a hero in Iran, and I'm gonna write about him for Americans who don't know anything about him. And then, I was doing a lot of research, and still have a lot of friends and family in Iran, and I was asking them to kind of go look at this library, or could you go to this museum, and could you get me this thing here? And the more I kept doing this research, the more I realized nobody in Iran knows who this kid is anymore. I mean, it was shocking. When I was growing up in Iran, there were schools named Howard Baskerville. There were streets named Howard Baskerville. His tomb, was a kind of pilgrimage site. People would come from all over the country on the anniversary of his death to pay homage to this kid who gave his life for the freedom of Iranians more than 100 years ago. And then it occurred to me that since the revolution, and so much of the revolution, of course, carried with this kind of anti-American ethos, all the sort of the collective memory of Howard Baskerville had been wiped clean. I mean, certainly he's not, all the schools were renamed, the streets were renamed. He's not taught in classes any longer. I had a friend of mine tell me that there's a string of really popular coffee shops in Tehran called Baskerville Coffee. But I would venture to guess that nobody who's in those coffee shops sipping lattes knows any more about, Howard Baskerville than Americans know who the hell Starbucks is. It's a sad situation. And so I'm very happy to say that this book, it's almost finished being translated into Persian. And we are not just making it available for free for any Persian language speaker, but we're working with bookstores and publishing houses in Iran. Remember, there's no copyright laws in Iran. So, you can do whatever you want to. But we're trying to work with a couple of the more prestigious bookstores to give them for free the ability to just print this book and make it available to Iranians and this generation who really, this is a story that I think would really motivate them and really make them think about the United States differently.
Had you been sitting on this idea for a while, or was there one particular thing that had kind of inspired you to say, all right, I'm going to put, pen to paper, so to speak, to get this out there?
Yeah, no, this is a book I wanted to write for a really, really long time. But like something would always come up. And then also, to be perfectly honest with you, there's so little that was available about Howard Baskerville, except for the most basic facts of his life. And people have talked about those basic facts for a very, very long time. He was a 22-year-old Christian missionary who went to Iran to preach the gospel in 1907 and then ended up fighting alongside his students in the first democratic revolution in the Middle East. It's called the Constitutional Revolution, and who ended up ultimately giving his life for the Iranian people at a time in which they were clamoring for the same basic rights and privileges that they're still clamoring for now, 115, 116 years later. And that was it. So I've always wanted to write this book, but I was like, well, that's not a book. That's a pamphlet. So the question was, could I learn more about him? And fortunately, I managed to find just the most incredible research assistant And we were able to uncover so many documents about Howard Baskerville in Russian and in Persian. And that was the thing that changed everything, right? I mean, yeah, there was hardly anything written about him in English, but as I say, for generations, he was this heroic figure. And so we found eyewitness testimony written in Persian, remembrances by his students, a couple of whom were actually with him, fighting shoulder to shoulder with him. One of whom was there when he was shot and killed, and letters written by his fellow teachers at the missionary school where he taught, and all of that started creating this kind of fully formed figure, this individual who had this extraordinary transformation. This is a guy who went to Iran literally to be a white savior. Like, that was he went there to save people's souls, to bring them to Jesus so that they would not burn in hell. That was his goal. And who, in the span of 18 months, had this absolute transformation where he got to know the people and the culture, fell in love with the country, and then recognized in a very human way that the rights and privileges that they were currently, while he was there, fighting and dying for, were rights and privileges that he just took for granted as an American. And despite the fact that he was told repeatedly by the school that employed him, by the church that had sent him there, by the US government that controlled him, that whatever was happening in Iran, this revolution that he had accidentally stepped into, was none of his business, right? He was there to teach his classes, preach the gospel, finish his 2-year service, get back on a boat, and come home. That was his job. Despite that, he had this absolute transformation where he realized that, as he said to his own students on the day that he quit his job and fully joined the revolution, that he could not bear to watch the suffering on the streets any longer. That the only way that he knew how to serve this country and these people that he had come to love was to give up his teaching position, was to quit his missionary work, was to ultimately abandon his American citizenship and to pick up a gun and go fight for their freedom. And that's exactly what he did.
You mentioned you found some research in Russian. Where's the connection or crossover there?
So Iran in the beginning of the 20th century was essentially a Russian vassal, right? It wasn't colonized by any means. Iran sort of proudly has this history that it's never been colonized. But okay, there's colonization and then there's, economic colonization. And that's really what Iran was living under. The entire north was more or less under the sphere of the influence of the Tsar of Russia, and the south was under the influence of the British government. And the Shah, the king of Iran, really maintained his position on that throne thanks to the largesse of the Russians. The Tsar paid for his army. In fact, the Iranian army, the Iranian military, was armed, uniformed, trained, and commanded by Russians, not by Iranians. And this was a way for the Tsar to maintain his sphere of influence on his southern border. Now, it is important to note that in 1905, so 2 years before Baskerville arrived in Iran, in 1905, Russia had its own revolution. Same thing. The people clamoring for a constitution and a parliament and a say in their government. And that revolution was ultimately crushed with overwhelming violence. And so when a similar revolution suddenly erupted in the empire, right to the south, the Tsar wanted to make sure to nip that in the bud as quickly as possible. So he made it very clear to the Shah of Iran that if he wanted to continue getting all those sweet, sweet rubles, then he needs to respond to this revolution with unbridled violence. And when the Shah kind of demurred, the Tsar said, well, then just let us do it. And that's exactly what happened. So the Russian trained, it was, make no mistake, it was Persian soldiers, but they were commanded by Russians. They were trained by Russians. And they were, many ways, promoting Russian interests in Iran. Now, I will say, again, the Tsar's interests were perfectly in line with the Shah's interests. The Shah also wanted to get rid of this revolution, was more than happy to use Russian cannons to do it. But that's the sort of the role that the Russians played. And so a lot of the information from this period, interestingly enough, comes from Russian sources. There were a lot of Russians in court in Iran at the time. And they wrote memoirs, they wrote histories, they wrote accounts of their time. And these aren't available in English. And so I was lucky enough to have a Russian speaking researcher who was able to find all this material and then translate the more important things into English. But that was a boon. That was absolutely a boon.
Fascinating. It's interesting how it's all connected.
Yeah.
What was your main goal with writing this book, and what message about Howard Baskerville did you want to get across?
That's a great question. Well, look, on the one hand, I just think this is a kid who should be known, right? This is an extraordinary life. And this is somebody who should be celebrated, somebody that both Iranians and Americans should be familiar with. But more than that, I think that in a way he can be a symbol for a new way of thinking, not just a new way of thinking about the relationship between the United States and Iran, but just a new way of thinking about, where we are right now in the world, the sort of conflicts between nation states. One of my favorite stories about Howard Baskerville happened at the end of his life. He had already joined the revolution, and the US government, as you can imagine, was freaking out, right? This idea that like an American citizen, let alone an American missionary, had joined a foreign revolution was something that the US government could not abide by. And so they sent an official, the US Consulate General, to the battlefield to talk some sense into Howard Baskerville. And this guy kind of, found him and sat him down and basically read him the riot act and said, you can't do this. This is not your country. These are not your people. This is not your fight. It's time for you to go home. Like you've got to get off the battlefield, go home. And he actually threatened Baskerville with treason against the United States if he did not cease his revolutionary activities. And this is kind of the most famous moment in Baskerville's life. He, in response, kind of looked at the battlefield, at all these people fighting for the most basic rights, and said, the only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth. And that is a very small difference. This was 1909, right? Here we are now, 14 years later. And the idea that the color of your skin, your nationality, the place where you just happen to be born, the religion that you were born into, your ethnicity, like these markers of your identity are nothing. They're meaningless. They don't mean anything in the face of human suffering. That the suffering of any one person anywhere in the world is the responsibility of all peoples everywhere. And it doesn't matter if they worship this particular God instead of that God, or if they happen to have been born over there instead of over here. Why do those things matter? And I just feel like for that 24-year-old kid at that point, right, to have that epiphany that a century ago is something that I wish all of us could learn from.
So you bring up the council going up to him, telling him to stand down for his revolutionary acts, and you have the cover of your book Zealot behind you. Do you see any commonalities between the historical Jesus and Howard?
It's funny that you asked that, because I really do. The process of writing this book felt very familiar. And I think partly it has to do with the fact that just as a person, not just as a thinker, as a writer, but just as a person, I am drawn to people who, when confronted with injustice and oppression, activate their faith to do something about it. That is the story of Jesus. It's the story of Moses. It's the story of Muhammad. And it's certainly the story of Howard Baskerville. It's the story of Martin Luther King. It's the story of Nelson Mandela. It's the story of Gandhi. People who, I mean, look, there's a lot that can be said about religion and religious people, right? There's a lot of problems. But what is the point of faith if it's not activated to do good in the world? What's the point, right? Then you're just a monk. Go live in a cave. If you call yourself a person of faith and you turned a blind eye to injustice and oppression, not just in your world, but everywhere in the world, then your faith is useless. Your faith is garbage, right? It doesn't really mean anything. But when I see people who then activate that faith, put it into action, even if it means their own demise, like it did with all those people that I mentioned, by the way, that to me, I think I'm just drawn to that, right? Those are the people that I'm drawn to. This is the people that I kind of want to be like. And so there are a lot of parallels between Baskerville and Jesus. But the truth is that they kind of represent the kinds of people that I like to write about and think about.
Talking about the kind of people you like to write about and read about, putting out the work that you put out, is that how you activate your faith?
Sort of. I mean, I do a lot in my life and with my family. We're a very active family. We are very globally aware. We try our hardest to put the morals and ethics that we think are important into the world. And we do that through our actions, and we do that through the things that we support, et cetera, and the volunteer work that we do. But insofar as any kind of platform that I may have as a writer or as a thinker, yeah, I want to sort of get other people to be excited about the kind of people that I'm excited about. I want to be able to provide models of behavior, these historical figures, and allow people to think of them in a different way. You mentioned Zealot. I think it's a great example because, so often I think when we think of somebody like Jesus, who carries a shit ton of baggage, obviously, we never really stop and think about him as a person, right? Like, whatever, you think, well, he didn't exist or he was God incarnate. Okay, whatever. But he was a person. There was a person that lived in a particular time and place. And that person did and said some extraordinary things that led to his torture and execution. And I think that, to me, that is someone worth knowing, right? Forget about whatever religious idea you may have about who this person is. Just that alone. You're talking about a poor, and I mean poorest of the poor, illiterate peasant from the backwoods of Galilee, right? Who took on the greatest empire the world had ever known. I want to know who that person is. Like, I don't even call him Fred if you want to. You don't need to call him Jesus. Just that sentence alone makes me want to know who this person is. And I think that that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah, that I want to create these impressions, models, examples for how people can think about how they navigate the complexities of the modern world, especially people of faith, people. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean like people of a particular religion, but people who do think that faith can be a good thing. It can be a positive force in the world.
Is that what led you to your own journey in Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, look, my journey, was kind of roundabout, right? Because I grew up Muslim, like everyone in Iran did. It's just kind of part of my identity. Um, and then when we came to the US, we sort of scrubbed our lives of really any religion. And I've always been fascinated by it, but never really had an opportunity to kind of explore it in any meaningful way. And then in high school, I heard the gospel story for the first time. And I mean, there's a reason why they say it's the greatest story ever told. It's a pretty great story. And I was completely blown away by it, and immediately converted to particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity at the time. And then when I decided that I was going to study religion for a living, I well, I had two kind of almost simultaneous uh, realizations. One of which is that there's a giant chasm between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, right? There's a chasm between this illiterate peasant, this Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews who lived, 2,000 years ago in the Galilee, and this ethereal God, uh, you know, who is the focus of Christianity. And that illiterate peasant was more interesting to me. Um, and then more importantly, I also came to a better understanding of what religion is, right? And that religion isn't faith, that these are two different things, that religion is just the language that we use to express faith. Faith is mysterious and ineffable and individualistic, and it's fundamentally emotion, right? Faith is an emotion like love is an emotion. Describe love, explain love, get someone to love someone or get someone to stop loving someone. Like, those are absurd statements. Now replace the word love with faith, and you can get an understanding of why it is that we get so much of these conversations wrong. But religion is just the language that we use to express this fundamental human emotion of faith. And if it's a language, then what does it matter which language you speak, right? What's the difference between French and German? Like, there is no difference. They're both just saying the same thing, just with different languages. And that's what religion is too. They're expressing very similar emotions, but using different symbols and metaphors. And those two realizations really affected me both as a scholar and the way that I kind of treat religion and religious history, but also as a person of faith. And so I kind of moved away from Christianity and went back a little bit more to the symbols and metaphors of my childhood, Islam.
When you had that moment in high school, were you already in California at that time, or was that in Oklahoma?
No, I was already in oh, you're seeing my Enid, Oklahoma. No,
Well,
I was already in California. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I spent some time in Oklahoma City, so I'm familiar with the Bible Belt, and now I'm down here in South Carolina. I was just curious, although I think oftentimes people don't realize how much how much religion impacts California. I mean, there's a lot of
no
faith in
question about it.
California.
Yeah. It's where all the biggest mega churches are.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too what you said about how there are so many similarities across the different faiths, yet, a lot of times it's always don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion when you're in, and it's like, but why don't we talk about what we have in common as opposed
Yeah.
to our differences? Because when you do dig into the stories and stuff, there is a lot of crossover and similarities and parallels.
Yeah, and that's kind of a lot of the work that I'm doing now, with TV and film and those kinds of things is precisely an attempt to try to have these conversations without getting bogged down in sort of the specificities of religion, right? Because look, when you're talking about faith, you're talking about the human condition and how we see ourselves in the world. And you can have some very fascinating discussions about that by using the arts, instead of grounding it in very specific religious language or ideas. Because look, ultimately human beings, we are tribal people. We're all about in groups and out groups. And so people are always saying, oh, I don't understand, why are religions always in conflict with each other? What? Do you not know humans? Do you not know a person? Like, there's nothing unique about religion. All ideologies bring us in conflict with each other: nationalism, ethnicity, race, religion. Like, they're just different ways of making us and them. Politics, that's what we do. We're humans. That's what we our minds sort of compel us towards. But when you start talking about the arts, right, film, television, music, you have ways of expressing, or let me just put it this way, you can communicate the same sort of ideas that you can when you're talking about religion without getting bogged down in the us and them part of it, the tribalism part of it.
I heard you speak on how you raise your kids and how each one, I believe you have 4 children and 3 of them are each a different religion, but you mentioned that children can see the similarities and they know it's all the same story. At what point in life do you think we become so narrow-minded that we only see the one story?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, but I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, I mean, look, we're a multi-faith family. My wife is Christian, and comes from a very devout Christian family, and we celebrate a lot of different holidays. I have one son who is, he calls himself an aspiring Jew. He tries very hard. Doesn't always make it. Sometimes gets a little bit bored with all the things that he has to do, and he's like, you know what, never mind. But he's working on it. He's getting ready for, he's got to make a decision about whether he wants to bar mitzvah or not. And so that's kind of the big question now, because it's like, once you do that, now you're no longer aspiring, right? Now you're taking it seriously. So he's got a decision to make. I have another son who is really fascinated by Hinduism, uh and has, sort of sees the world in those terms. And so, we make sure that we celebrate all of the rituals and the holidays, and make sure everybody feels like they've got some kind of sense of ownership to it. And when I tell people this, as you rightly note, the response is always like, well, you're just confusing your kids. You're confusing them. It's like, it's too much. Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, like, it's too much. They can't keep up with it. No, you can't keep up with it. They're fine, right? My boys, will go to a temple and say, oh yeah, this is exactly like, the mosque that we went to, or this is exactly like they understand in a deep and visceral way that it's all the same. It's all the same. Everybody's saying the same thing, but they're just saying it in different ways. So pick one that you like, and pick one that kind of turns you on and that excites you and that you want to kind of get involved in. I've said this numerous times, but my wife and I, really live by the words of the Buddha, who said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. And so we encourage our children to pick a well, because what's important isn't the well, the water is what's important. And guess what? We're all drinking the same water. It doesn't matter which well you choose, the water is the same. And I don't know, grown-ups, for some reason, you say that and they're like, oh, this is too confusing, and how can you keep it up straight? And of course they're not all the same, and of course the water is different. And kids are like, it's so obvious to them, in a way that I don't know why it isn't for grown-ups. I really don't.
I think that's awesome how you're raising your children and let them choose and educating them on all religions out there. And parents often repress their kids, and their kids tend to go the opposite direction. Do you think that your upbringing and your father being an atheist might have been a little bit of why you dedicated your life to religion?
Totally. People ask me all the time, like, why would an 11-year-old be so fascinated by religion? Because my dad told me not to be. That's why. And to your point too, it's funny because, like, I say this a lot to a lot of my secular and my atheist friends who have kids. And they always ask, like, well, my greatest fear is that my kid will become, will join some cult or something, or will become some kind of religious fanatic. And so to keep that from happening, I remove religion from their lives. And it's like, oh, no. Like, that's not the way to keep that from happening. Like, ask your average cultist, did you grow up with religion? And they'll probably say, no, I did not. When you are sort of when you're sort of that world is removed from you, it opens the door for other people to come in and give you the answers, for like the meaning of life or whatever. And what I always tell them is, look, if you want your kids to grow up to not be religious, you should teach them about religion. That's how you do it. Teach them about religion. Teach them what religion is. Teach them the religions of the world. And maybe they'll become pious, but I guarantee you they will never become a fundamentalist. Because while the term fundamentalism gets thrown around a lot and it has a lot of, slippery meaning, essentially we use it to mean someone who thinks that there is only one truth and it is theirs. I don't know what my kids will grow up to be. I don't know. I know for a fact, however, that they will not grow up to fall for the lie that there is only one truth in the world. I know that because they have experienced the multiplicity of truths. They've experienced it in a deep and personal way. I have no worry about them falling under the influence of some, person who comes to them and says, I have the truth and no one else has it. And for you to have it, you need to follow me. I don't have any worries about that, because the concept of one truth doesn't exist in their minds. They don't have that as a block. So yeah, it's this kind of a funny thing that I always kind of encourage parents, that, like, look, if you're worried about your kids becoming too religious, teach them about religion and they won't be too religious.
Yeah, it's almost those cult figures. They're feeding off of those people, or looking specifically for those people who don't have a faith, or wandering looking for a purpose. There's the name Tribe of 12 maybe, but there's a cult that kind of operates off of the Appalachian Trail. And they have a hostel that they have people come in, and that's kind of where they get their people. Is a lot of people that go on the Appalachian Trail are kind of seeking some answers or looking for some answers, and it's just kind of a natural crossover to get some of those people to join the organization, if you will.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that happens, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Allowing your kids to source their faith, was that something that you and your wife had planned for a while, or is that kind of something that you just kind of came to as you were raising them?
Yeah, it's funny because when we met, there was a lot of conversations about we want to raise them both in a Muslim and Christian background. Um, and then we started off with twins, and then very soon, we realized that neither of the twins have any interest in either Christianity or Islam. And we're like, oh, okay then. Like, what do we do? Like, we need help at this point. So, fortunately, I have a very diverse, community of friends, and so I was able to ask my Jewish friends and my friends who are rabbis, hey, I have a boy who like wants to be a Jew. What do I do? And same with, I have friends who are Indian and who are Hindu. And so that actually kind of it changed the way that we were thinking. Like, we used to think of ourselves as an interfaith family, and that's how we sort of raised the kids. Like, we're an interfaith family and we're going to raise interfaith kids, and then very quickly realized, oh no, we're not. We're a multi-faith family, and everyone's got their own ideas and their own views, and and people will figure out. I mean, my youngest son, he's kind of semi interested. uh I remember a couple of years back, we were talking about, where his interests may lie, and, he's seen the world and he's experienced all these things, and was there any religion that seemed particularly, interesting to him? And he thought about it for a little bit, and he said, let me ask you this. Which religion has the most candy?
Smart.
And I was like, Christianity. I mean, obviously. And he was like, yeah, I think I picked that one. So I was like, all right, then. Again, it's important to just meet kids where they are, but I think to sort of ignore it or to excise religion out of their lives because you're worried, that's the kind of thing that will just make your worst fears come true.
Reza, I really appreciate your perspective and you sharing your perspective and how you're raising your kids and some of the troubleshooting that you've had to go through. And as podcasters, Rich and I are always looking to other interviewers, other podcasters to up our game. And once we kind of booked this interview, we realized really quick you have spoken to the who's who of interviewers and podcasters. Who stands out to you of all the people you've talked to? What has been your favorite interview? What has been your least favorite? Anyone listening to the show, so, if they can't get enough of this interview, do you have a suggestion of another one to go check out?
That's really, really good. Let's see. I'm not gonna say my least favorite because that's not good. That I don't want that to come back to
It's
me.
bad for business.
It's bad for business.
Maybe most controversial then, if there was one.
Most controversial. That's an interesting one. Well, look, um, I hate to say this because I think he's a very, very smart man and he's doing a lot of good in the world. But we interviewed Peter Singer, who is a philosopher and ethicist, world famous, has written many, many, many books, has done wonderful things, but who is one of the premier um, evangelists for effective altruism. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's this idea that what you should do in life, it's a utilitarian idea. What you should do in life is make as much money as you possibly can so that you can give it away. And this was the Sam Bankman-Fried experience, or you see this with a lot of these billionaires who are like, yeah, I'm just gonna basically make as much money as I possibly can, and then I will give it all away. Or you hear this from people like Bezos, uh, who is, very proud of the fact that he's given away hundreds of millions of dollars. And it, if your job is to fuck the world so that you can then give charity, then something is wrong, right? And when we were talking in that conversation, like it's very hard because I have an enormous amount of respect for Singer as a thinker and as an ethicist, but there's no getting around this idea, like the fact that we should be lauding Jeff Bezos and Peter Thiel and all these billionaires because they're giving their money away. That doesn't work for me. I mean, what you did to make that money cannot be made up, no matter how much of it you give away. So those are some of the awkward conversations, as I'm sure that as a podcaster that you gotta sometimes have, and that was certainly one of them.
I know you have a production company, and I believe Zealot was in production or about to be in production. Are we going to see a film about Howard Baskerville at some point?
I'm working on it. I mean, I'm very proud of this book, but I think anyone who reads it can see the cinematic nature of this story. It's an extraordinary life. The fact that it's true is, I think, just remarkable. And we all know the truth. Like, no matter how successful a book can be, it can't really hold a torch to a successful film or a television show insofar as the reach. And so I recognize that. And yeah, I am actively in the process of developing this into a film project.
Do you have an ideal main lead character actor?
It's funny. I mean, I'm not saying this for any other reason than it is true, but if you look at a picture of Howard Baskerville, he looks suspiciously like Timothy Chalamet. Just saying, if Chalamet is out there listening to this podcast, just, looks suspiciously like you. That's all.
We'll get that Airey Bros bump for you.
Yeah.
Reza, we have the final 4 questions we ask all our guests, but before we get into that, if Rich doesn't have another question for you, is there anything on Howard Baskerville we did not speak about today that you think our audience should know?
It's funny, and I guess maybe it's because I'm just getting so much older now. I still come back to this idea that this kid was 22. I don't know what you were doing when you were 22. I'm pretty much guessing it wasn't fighting a foreign nation's revolution for freedom. And I just think about, like, God, like that, the idea of his youth, I think, still blows my mind, that he was making these decisions, that he was bucking his family and his church and his religion and his country, to do what he thought was right. And I can only hope that when my boys are in their early 20s, that's the kind of passion and fire that they have.
People were just built different back then.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
I guess my one last question, if memory serves, when you first came here, you went to Edmond, Oklahoma, correct? Or did
Enid, Oklahoma.
You did go to Enid.
Enid.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's just a pure coincidence that I happen to be wearing my Enid, Oklahoma shirt, which my best friend bought me for my 50th birthday. I don't go around advertising Enid, Oklahoma all the time.
It's a small little place.
A very small place.
Yeah. Oklahoma's a good place, though.
It is. It's a really good place. Wonderful people.
Nice people. Very nice. Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
All right. So our final 4, first question I got for you is, are you a coffee drinker?
I mean, to an extreme. Yes. To the
Had-
point where sometimes my pee smells like the inside of a Starbucks. Yeah.
I feel you on that one. How do you brew your coffee, and how do you take it?
Oh, okay. Well, here you go, podcasters. So there was an advertiser, a sponsor for my podcast called Commentator. And if you don't know about Commentator, man, get to know them. So they're these little tiny frozen pods of coffee, and they have managed to recreate the pour over experience through these little frozen capsules. And I'm obsessed, man. I'm obsessed. I have like 3 of them a day. Commentator.
Right, I'm gonna have to look into that.
You had us at pour over.
Yeah. Because like the pour over, it takes too much work. I mean, who's gonna do that like in your own home? Like it's just too much work. So to fake the pour over with these little frozen capsules. Yeah. Hey, Commentator, if you're listening, send me more stuff.
Send us some too if you're listening.
Send us. Here's another one for you. The water and the mineral profile has a big impact on how well your coffee tastes and how much it tastes just like a coffee shop. So there's a company called Third Wave Water. And what they've done is they've taken the water mineral profile from that World Barista Federation or whatever it is that good coffee shops have in their filtration system, and they've dehydrated that water. So you add those little packets of dehydrated water with the mineral profile to a gallon of distilled water, and then that's the water that you use when you brew your coffee, and then that's going to give you that ideal mineral profile to bring out all the notes and stuff. So
Love
might
it.
even take your coffee experience to another level, and it sounds like it's already at a pretty high level. Commentator?
Commentator, yeah.
Commentator, all right. Reza, do you have a daily practice or rituals that you do on a regular basis to show up as the strongest version of yourself?
Yes. We have a very strict rule in our house, which is that we have every breakfast and every dinner together, no matter what. And look, sometimes it's hard, and we don't always make it. But we started this practice during COVID, when everybody was home anyway. And when as COVID kind of came to an end, we just made a commitment to stick to it, and it's changed everything for us. Every breakfast and every dinner, we have it together. It's extraordinary.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Are you the cook? Is it a group effort? Is your wife?
No, it is not a group effort. It is 100% me.
Okay.
Yeah, my wife burns water. No, there is no group effort in this at all.
Okay.
And she'll be the first to admit it too. So
What's your go-to breakfast meal?
I make a pretty mean French toast.
Ooh,
with
okay.
like vanilla and cinnamon.
Yeah.
Oof.
All right.
Yeah, that's my jam.
Nice.
What kind of bread are you using?
I use the what is it? What's the term? Jesus. I get it from Trader Joe's. It's like
Ezekiel bread?
It's like no. It's like this thick cut, like almost Texas toast kind of.
Okay.
All right.
I think it's awesome, by the way, that you have meals with your family. That is something that is not happening. So I respect to that.
Yeah, when I grew up, we never had meals together as a family. Even if we were at home, we would eat in like different rooms, and so it's been transformative for us.
Awesome.
What
are you listening to right now? Music, podcasts, audiobooks? Are you reading anything?
Yeah, there's a couple of podcasts that I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with Joel Stein's podcast, Story of the Week. And I've been listening to David Eagleman's podcast, which I guess is called inner cosmos. Eagleman's a cool dude. He's a neuroscientist who, like popular neuroscientist. I'm also a kind of a devout Raiders fan, a long-suffering Raiders fan. So I listen to a lot of sports talk radio just to make myself miserable, really.
You didn't feel betrayed when they moved to Vegas?
We don't talk about that.
Okay.
Nobody I know calls them Las Vegas Raiders.
Do you have a Rams or a Chargers hat at all in somewhere?
No.
No.
Hell no.
Okay.
No.
Last one we have for you. Do you have a guilty pleasure or guilty pleasures?
I mean, it kind of goes back to like my guilty pleasure is the Raiders. You know, you look at me, you don't think of me as like a diehard football fan, and I'm not really a football fan. I'm just kind of a Raiders fan. And yeah, I could tell you everything about the team and its history and everything. And my wife doesn't get it. Like my wife's like, I don't understand. Like all it does is make you miserable. Like, and she does that thing that non-sports fans do, which is, why don't you just root for another team? Like, why don't you root for a good team? It's like, if only that were an option. Yeah, that's my guilty pleasure.
All right, right on. Do you watch games regularly?
Yeah, I'll never miss a
Okay.
Raiders game.
Okay. And then I guess the last one I have, curious, do you think your connection to the Raiders was something that as you came to America, that was something to kind of, connect you to other kids in school and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I came, after a year or so in Oklahoma, we moved to the Bay Area, and this was the 1980s. So it was like the Oakland Raiders, and they were the best team, and they were dirty and mean, and and fun. And it was when I discovered what football was. And so yeah, I think that's really where it came from, is just kind of that experience of being in America and understanding football in the first place, and seeing these kind of bad boys and thinking, yeah, that's kind of what I want to do. That's what I want to be.
That's awesome.
Reza, thank you so
Yeah.
much. We've done over 300 episodes, and I must tell you, you made us do our work as far as research, and you had me nervous, but it made me feel alive. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that, guys. Thanks a lot. Send me an email when it's up.
Right.
Definitely. Thank you for your time tonight.
Bye-bye.
Bye.